relationship had soured, the BBC producer deciding his arrogance towards people who turned up with what Porteous considered to be rubbish was not in the spirit of the show. Two things had eventually led to his firing. The first was when he'd reduced an elderly woman to tears when he'd harshly pointed out the supposed Turner seascape she'd brought him, which had been in her family for years, was nothing more than a painted-over print, cuttingly telling her that a child painting by numbers could have done a more convincing job. And the second, when, in a rare error of judgment, he'd declared a 16th-century Arbelgrimmer landscape as genuine and worth conservatively £200,000, and it had subsequently turned out to be a fake. Concerned for his reputation, he'd stubbornly refused to back down and admit his error. A fastidious man, with a love for beautiful things in both his private and work lives, Charlie Porteous was a creature of habit that you could set the proverbial watch by. In his case, a £45,000 Rolex Submariner. Every weekday he left his gated mansion in Brighton and Hove's Tongdean Avenue on the dot of 6:35 a.m. and drove his Bentley to Brighton Station car park, catching the fast train to London's Victoria Station. From there, his trusty London driver, Mihat El-Hadidi, would whisk him in his Mercedes S-Class to his gallery in Duke Street, arriving at 8:20 a.m., well before his 5 members of staff. 4 evenings a week, Porteous would travel home on the train from London Victoria, and he would walk through his front door at 7:15 p.m. precisely. But on Thursdays, he would dine at his members' club, either with a client or with a chum from the art world, before taking a late train back. Tonight, however, he had spent a delightful evening socialising with his goddaughter at an Italian restaurant close to his gallery. His father had given him a piece of advice he now bitterly wished he had heeded. It was to only invest in what he knew. But just over 2 years ago, a wealthy Australian property developer client, Kerry Dundas, who had bought paintings from him to the value of several millions over the past decade, had offered him a deal that, in the words of the Godfather, was an offer he could not refuse. A rare chance to partner the man in buying an entire 42-storey block of flats in North London, Reynolds Heights, which was up for a bargain price for a quick sale, due to the current owner being overstretched. And, named after a famous artist, it had to be a good omen, Porteous had thought. For a £10 million investment each, they could turn a profit of, conservatively, £5 million within a year. His judgment had been clouded by the fact that the lease on the building adjoining his gallery was coming up for sale. If he could buy it, he would double the size of his gallery, leaving his son the legacy of being the largest dealer in their field in the country. The bank had been happy to lend Porteous his share of the money, secured against his rock-solid assets, on a 2-year term loan. Then, 3 months later, when they were in the process of making a sale every bit as profitable as Kerry Dundas had forecast, he was suddenly unable to contact the man. The next thing he knew, after finally engaging his solicitors, was that Dundas was in prison in Dubai, under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Porteous had to face that he'd been duped and lost every penny of his investment. The bank, while initially sympathetic to his plight, was, as he ruefully confided to a friend, just like the old joke, that bankers were people who lent you an umbrella when it was sunny and wanted it back when it was raining. But tonight, for the first time in many sleepless months, he had an optimistic spring in his step as he alighted at Brighton Station, shortly after midnight, and he had good reason. He had recently made, he was certain, one of the sweetest purchases of his life, very possibly the sweetest, by a country mile, one that potentially could get him out of the deep doo-doo in which he was now mired. His gallery, founded after the war by his late father, had built up a specialist reputation for paintings by leading French old masters, such as Nicolas Poussin, Jean-Honoré Fragonard, Claude Lorrain, and Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. His old man, a former art student at Warsaw's Academy of Fine Arts, who had arrived in England as a penniless Jewish refugee from Poland in 1938, was a natural-born salesman with an eye for a painting and an even wider eye for a bargain. He'd decided that his assumed name of Louis Porteous would play better in the snooty British art world and anti-Semitic post-war climate than the one with which he'd landed in England, Jakub Lewandowski. Charlie Porteous had inherited his father's appreciation of landscapes, portraits, and mythological senses of the French old masters, and, like his old